Well, greetings, everyone. My name's Orville Schell. I direct the Center in U.S. China Relations and also co-chair a task force in U.S. China Policy, which is produced through a working group. This report prioritizing Southeast Asian American China strategy. And really pleased to have joining us today, David Shambaugh, who headed up the report. We went to Singapore and we listened to all representatives from all of Southeast Asia's 10 countries. I think we wanted to undertake this report because we all felt that Southeast Asia is an incredibly important part of the world. It's caught in between the United States and China. It's difficult for it to know which way to turn. And in almost every case, each of the countries finds its largest trade relationship to be with China. But on the other hand, I think we all came away feeling that there's great affinity, great friendship with the United States. And the question that really we wanted to unwrap was, how do we deport ourselves better as a country towards this great engine of growth in the world, namely Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries? They're the fifth largest economic bloc in the world. So to do that, we've assembled for you today a group of members who have participated in this project and helped put the findings together in the report that I think many of you have and have read. We'd like to turn to them right now. We'll start with David Shambaugh, who's a professor at George Washington University, who headed up the program. With a second, we'll turn to Danny Russel to talk about some diplomatic aspects of the relationship. Danny was a former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs at the State Department. Then we'll turn to Charlene Barshefsky, former trade representative, to highlight the importance of trade and economics and what the U.S. might do to sort of pick up the connection with Asia in a more fulsome way in that regard. And then finally, we'll turn to Karl Eikenberry, former general ambassador, to talk about the military considerations that we have to confront in the area, particularly in the South China Sea and by indirection in the Taiwan Straits. So, David, let me turn things over to you to maybe embroider a bit on what I've said and then pick up on some of the key recommendations that we've come up with and tell us a little bit about how you see the problem and why this is an important issue for the United States.
Right. Well, thank you, Orville, and greetings everyone online, both here in North America and across the Pacific in Southeast Asia, where it's the late evening. Let me embroider, if that's a nice way to put it, try and add a little bit to your good overview and introduction, Orville. Make maybe four or five points. Time is brief, ladies and gentlemen. We've got just 1 hour in total, just to have a little roadmap. We're going to collectively run about 45 minutes between the four of us, and then we're going to open for questions and so I guess if you have a question, you're supposed to put it in the chat function, and then they will be fed to Orville at the end of the hour. The last 15-20 minutes, he will field those, and so that's the sort of roadmap for how we're going to proceed here. But let me just kick it off by observing, as you just did, that the United States and China are locked into really a comprehensive, long-term competitive rivalry, a competition for influence, if nothing else, in virtually every region of the world, every continent, and most countries of the world, and across virtually all functional sectors. So the question for the United States is not whether to compete with China, but how to compete with China. And also how these different regions of the world, whether it's Latin America, Middle East, Europe, or in this case, Southeast Asia, are responding to and trying to navigate the competition between the two superpowers, the sort of pincer pressure that they're all feeling in different regions. They're going to react differently, of course, for different considerations, their national interests, their cultures, and their respective relationships with Washington and Beijing. But in this particular case, this working group really zeroed in on, obviously, Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia's been pursuing a strategy for navigating this competition, which I guess we do characterize in the report as a kind of multi-actor hedging strategy. The more, the merrier. The more external powers and so-called middle powers that are involved in Southeast Asia, the better from Southeast Asia's standpoint. What they want to avoid is a kind of binary pincer pressure, as I say, between the U.S. and China. So from their perspective, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, European Union, Canada, and others are all part of their strategy for navigating between and trying to create some space and maintain their own autonomy, which is prized in the region. So we went to Singapore in May and had a very, very productive two-day conference with the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies. The USAC Institute were wonderful hosts to us, and we had a very candid two-day meeting, which you can read about in the report. But our purpose was, as Orville said at the top, to listen, because Americans don't always listen very well. But we feel that for the United States to have the most effective, most competitive strategy and policy towards Southeast Asia, it obviously should take into account the perspectives of Southeast Asians, and there's no singular Southeast Asian perspective. That's point number one about Southeast Asia. There are 10 countries of ASEAN. Each one has very different perspectives. So that's what our report really is about. It tries to drill down into and across the Southeast Asian ASEAN region to see how the region's reacting to the U.S.-China rivalry, what instruments and comparative advantages and weaknesses, both Beijing and Washington, if you will, the United States and China bring to the rivalry in the region. But particularly the report is aimed at fashioning a more effective, as I say, American policy for advancing American interests that coincide with and have synergies with the Southeast Asians. That is one of the main takeaways, that the United States should view Southeast Asia in its own intrinsic right, on its own important merits. As Orville just mentioned, it's collectively the 5th largest economy in the world. I'll give you any number of other statistics that are in the report about the importance of Southeast Asia. So the best way to compete with China is just pursue bilateral and multilateral through ASEAN relationships with the countries of the region, and not try and fashion American policy that is reactive to what China is doing. The report has sections in it you can see for yourself on both the American footprint, if you will, in the region, and the Chinese footprint in the region. Each of those contain, economic, military security, diplomatic, cultural, soft power, you might say, elements, both powers. And we explore those in some considerable detail. We lay those out. And then at the end of the report, and this is where I want to just cut to the chase in the interest of time, we offer a number of recommendations for American policy. But it's not just we as a 8-person working group. We, as has been said, we went to Singapore to listen very carefully to all Southeast Asian perspectives. We had a unique conference. We had 22 participants from around the region, including all 10 ASEAN countries represented, at least one person from all 10. So there's one section of recommendations that actually comes from the Southeast Asians for the United States, how you, America, can do better. So let me just tick through those, and then I'm going to very selectively highlight a few of the recommendations from our working group for the U.S. government. And then my colleagues, Danny, Charlene, and Karl will drill down, into those three areas: diplomacy, economics, and security. But so these recommendations from our Southeast Asian colleagues, let me just tick through them rather briefly. First, be consistent in the American approach to the
Not with the question.
America's greatest failing and weakness in the region is its kind of episodic, at least government engagement. It has very deep non-government engagement that is not, in fact, very well appreciated by Southeast Asians. I'll come back to that point. Second recommendation they made, and these were very candid, constructive. I must say the kind of atmosphere of honesty and partnership was very genuine. So they spoke candidly to us Americans. And one of the things they said is forget about American primacy. The region is now a genuinely multi-actor region, and China may in fact be the region's primary power. The United States is only one of many regional powers, so adjust your diplomacy accordingly. Third, they recommended that we tone down the rhetoric about the so-called rules-based order. Southeast Asians see hypocrisy in such American protestations and view these as Western rules imposed upon non-Western countries. As one of the participants at the conference eloquently put it, the so-called liberal international order is neither liberal, international, nor an order. Fourth suggestion they offered for us is that the U.S. cultural capital in the region remains strong, but has eroded. And we have a section in the report that goes through the various polls and surveys that have been done in the last couple of years, which intriguingly shows that the United States has a much better reputation among so-called elites in the region. China has a far better reputation amongst sort of average citizens. These polls come from the Lowy Institute in Australia and from the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore itself. So U.S. does have substantial soft power and residual respect, but it's eroded and it cannot be taken for granted, and it needs work to improve. They also recommended to us, fifthly, that the U.S. military-to-military engagement and presence in the region is America's strongest and best asset. They appreciate it. They want it to remain and be strengthened and improved, but they don't want it advertised, shall we say. I think Karl will come back and speak to that a little bit more. But they also suggested that we, the United States, develop a much more comprehensive approach to the region that goes beyond security and mill and really embraces a more fulsome diplomatic posture, a cultural soft power posture, and certainly, as Charlene is going to speak to, a much hard to get less, a more robust economic commercial posture. And they recommended to, quote, get in the regional economic game. I'm just going to tag that and let Charlene unpack that for the audience. Then they recommended that the United States do much better in public diplomacy in the region. One person said, China is kicking your butt, you Americans. Get in the game. There is a competition of narratives going on between China and America, if you know it, you Americans, but you don't seem to know it. So they were very critical of the American public diplomacy in the region. They were very critical, the next point, about American diplomats. They argue, get American diplomats up to speed. They are not seen as effective as Chinese diplomats in the region. They also suggested the United States is overly bilateral in its approach to the region. It needs to become more multilateral to work with ASEAN, as a collectivity, which the Chinese do. We have a table in the report of, I think, something like 40 different multilateral initiatives that China does with ASEAN. I'm not sure we could have a table that even had 5 for the United States, perhaps. But so that was another recommendation of theirs. Then they argued, don't try to out-China China, one person said, economically. Let China do what it does well. It builds infrastructure. You guys, you Americans, do what you do well. Again, Charlene will speak to this. Service. We're kind of a facilitative economy. Services. and other areas. But, bridges, ports, railroad, high-speed rail, we don't even have high-speed rail in the United States. And then finally, they argue that the Biden administration's emphasis on democracy versus authoritarianism does not go down well in the region. And they suggested that the United States factor the Middle East and America's support for Israel into its relations with the region, given the preponderance of Islamic societies and states. So that's just a quick synopsis of what our Southeast Asian friends suggested to us. So let me just note, maybe in closing, just a few, 2 or 3 of our own recommendations. We have 16 American recommendations to go with 15 Southeast Asian recommendations. So you all can read the report for yourselves. But I guess I'd highlight 2 or 3. One, the U.S. should just play to its strengths, be confident, be proactive, and adopt a comprehensive and positive approach to the region. Don't just be reactive to China. Again, Danny Russel, I think, is going to speak to this in a moment. And then another recommendation is the United States should prioritize and fund programs that help restore its soft power and its cultural, you might say, appeal, and increase its influence in the region. The polls that we have indicate, as I said, that the U.S. has a reservoir of respect that has eroded and needs further work, which comes to the third really strong recommendation we make about public diplomacy. Our public diplomacy is underperforming at best. So we Americans agree completely with the Southeast Asians there. We've really got to up our game, and we need a much more comprehensive, we need to scrub our entire public diplomacy posture in the region. And we have a number of very specific recommendations there. And then fourthly, I guess lastly, I should say, which Charlene is going to speak to, get in the regional economic game. So I'll let her unpack that. And in the security realm, which Karl is going to speak to, it is our strength. It is underappreciated. The United States, with the exception of Myanmar and Laos, the United States has very deep, extensive security assistance programs with 8 of the 10 ASEAN states. Not well appreciated in the region, but by the publics, I should say. The governments themselves appreciate it. I'll let Karl speak to that. But that's a strength that needs to be built out and built up even further, including so-called non-traditional security assistance. So I'll stop there. That's just a teaser, hopefully, for those of you to at least read the report, and for my colleagues to unpack a little bit further. So I guess I will hand the baton now to Danny Russel, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific and distinguished American diplomat. So Danny, over to you.
Thanks, David. I'll begin, if I may, with a personal observation on the diplomacy findings in the report, because one very important takeaway for me from our Southeast Asian interlocutors, some of whom are themselves experienced former diplomats, is that, notwithstanding the howling of Chinese wolf warriors, and despite the historical and ideological baggage that China carries in the region, and despite episodes of tin-eared clumsiness, the fact is that Chinese diplomats in Southeast Asia can be very effective. And it's not just that China has a huge economic footprint. It's not just that China's brought immense resources to bear in infrastructure and so on. Today, there's a much more targeted hand-to-hand Chinese diplomatic engagement and outreach that includes public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, much more than I saw, say, a decade ago when I was at the State Department. And our Southeast Asian interlocutors in this project, none of whom are naive about China, clearly diagnosed that diplomacy as largely effective. Now, I mention it because I think it's an important context for the task force's findings on diplomacy, and I'll build on, David, your comprehensive synopsis by saying, first and foremost, that we concluded that the Biden administration certainly deserves credit for actively re-engaging with ASEAN, with the countries of Southeast Asia, special summit with ASEAN leaders in Washington, upgrading the status of the relationship to what they call a comprehensive strategic partnership. The visits by the president, the vice president, secretary of state of defense, the economic cabinet secretaries, and also for some creative diplomatic initiatives across a wide range of important areas. And we recognize that, as you mentioned, David, that polls continue to show favorable attitudes towards the United States and much of the region. Nevertheless, the project found that these positive factors were undermined by a number of problems and shortcomings, some of which you've mentioned. I think overall, the clear message was that the story of what the U.S. is doing for the region, in the region, and how it benefits the region, that story isn't getting told, certainly not well enough to penetrate widely and to have adequate impact. For one thing, American diplomats are not present or visible, at least not enough. That's what we heard. Ambassadorships are vacant for extended periods. American diplomats obviously deal with host government officials and post on social media and so on, but just not adequately out and about, not as actively engaged in the economic, social, political, media, cultural circles as Southeast Asians want them to be. And in the same vein, I think the lightning quick visits by senior U.S. officials, we heard, often skip the kind of public speeches or public engagements, the sort of things that reinforce domestic political support for the policies that these officials are advocating to host government officials. Another bottom line concern is with the U.S. strategic narrative. What we call public diplomacy isn't just, Hollywood movies and July 4th barbecues. And David, as you mentioned, American messaging needs to be much more sophisticated than democracy good, autocracy bad. Our claim to be the champion of the rules-based order and the internet and of the defender of international law and rules, as we heard in our dialogue, sounds very hypocritical to Southeast Asian leaders, particularly after their experience with America First. And in that connection, I think, like the rest of the world, we found in Southeast Asia a very considerable trepidation about the prospect of another radical shift in the direction of American policy if the White House changes hands again in 2024. We heard the Southeast Asians say, in effect, they don't need an American Paul Revere riding through the region, warning them that the Chinese are coming. They know it. They've learned a thing or two about the Chinese over the last millennia. And importantly, they believe that they've developed a variety of largely effective coping mechanisms. Now, having the U.S. present and engaged in an important way in the region, particularly in security, is essential to them to establish balance overall. But they aren't vested in ensuring that the United States has a decisive lead over China. They want both powers engaged. They want the best of both worlds. And if the ratio between China and the United States is 49-51 or 51-49, that's really not an issue for them. I think what we heard was that a more effective American strategic narrative is going to be one that lays out America's value add, what it's contributing, what we have in common, and how we are advancing shared interests in the region. And David, as you alluded to, one that is framed in terms of America and Southeast Asia, not in terms of America versus China, where Southeast Asia is just the chessboard or worse, the battlefield. Another important message was that the American strategic narrative is undercut by its conspicuous absence from regional trade arrangements. I'll leave that issue to Charlene. And we were told, as I mentioned, that polling, while it may show generally favorable attitudes towards the U.S., particularly among elites, as David said, we're spending down our capital rather than replenishing. So I've spent my time describing really the diagnoses from the dialogue, not the prescriptions that are laid out in the report. David ticked through key recommendations, and they're very succinctly laid out in the last 5 pages of the paper, which I commend to you. But the last observation I'll make is this, that the recommendations that are germane to diplomacy largely hinge on Congress's willingness to make badly needed investments in people and foreign policy programs. Upping our diplomatic game requires not only that we remove roadblocks that are leaving ambassadorial posts empty and so on, but full funding for diplomatic programs, for diplomatic personnel, and for the resources that they utilize. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Danny. I think all of us were struck during our meetings by the sort of incipient friendliness of Southeast Asia towards the United States. It's kind of an underexploited opportunity, and I think we all came away with that sentiment. Now, let's turn to you, Charlene, former U.S. Trade Representative, because I think this is an area that both David and Danny have suggested does need some attention. What can we do on that front, Charlene, to make Southeast Asia more comfortable and I suppose in the end we'd have to say also more resistant to the predations of wolf warrior diplomacy from China?
Well said. Thank you. Let me just start by saying that I think one of our key takeaways from our meetings in Singapore, which were, as David said, quite intense, is that the U.S. regional posture runs counter to the paramount role of trade and investment in the region. It runs counter to the region's status as the epicenter of global trade. The region accounts for over half of global GDP, more than a third of global goods trade, up from a quarter just 10 years ago. Looking ahead, the region is poised to be the world's economic powerhouse in growth and innovation, with over half of global growth expected to come from the region over the next 30 years. The Indo-Pacific is also the world's largest contributor to the buildup of preferential trade agreements globally, accounting for about half of the 330 agreements that exist. And these are agreements that are bilateral, they're regional, they're multilateral in form. They are broader in scope, increasingly, deeper in obligation. And ASEAN figures particularly prominently in this plethora of agreements. Why is that? Because for ASEAN, which is highly trade dependent, trade and trade expansion is essential to economic growth, to jobs, to living standards. We heard this repeatedly, and of course, the statistics bear this out. By contrast, as both Danny and David and Orville have said, the U.S. is absent from the regional trade architecture, represented largely by the RCEP agreement and by CPTPP. The U.S., with respect to ASEAN, is a party to only one free trade agreement, and that is with Singapore. This at a time when the U.S. commercial presence in ASEAN, though it's diverse, it's substantial, it is growing, is nonetheless declining relative to China and has done so in every year since 2012. So China's trade with ASEAN has quadrupled since 2012, grown 4 times since 2012. It's now approximately double that of the United States, reaching nearly $1 trillion last year. The reversal in what had been U.S. primacy in trade with ASEAN is absolutely startling when you consider that just 20 years ago, U.S. trade with ASEAN was 3 times that of China. So China's emergence as the dominant player in some of the most important aspects of Asian economic life merits special attention by the United States, as does the sharp relative decline in U.S. trade with ASEAN. And this is important not only with respect to ASEAN growth and development, but with respect to U.S. influence in the region, which has declined markedly, with respect to U.S. economic influence in the region, which has declined markedly, with respect to rulemaking, and with respect to helping ensure that ASEAN in particular remains an independent power, an independent broker between the various powers that exist now and will exist in Asia going forward. It also means that ASEAN must be able to resist the coercive economic forces to which it is now particularly subject, given the U.S. receding role in relative terms in the region. Preferential trade agreements are a critical tool to leveling the playing field for the U.S. in this epicenter of trade in the ASEAN countries. Market access barriers that are quite substantial persist for trade and investment. They do not persist with respect to China because of China's free trade agreement with the ASEAN countries, or certainly they are much mitigated by that agreement with China. But in addition to leveling the playing field, preferential agreements, as I think anyone listening to this knows, are also a tool of geopolitics. And given China's growing economic dominance in the region, given its regional influence more broadly, given its hegemonic aims in the Asia Pacific, the U.S. can ill afford a diminished trade and economic profile in ASEAN or absent itself from the region's economic architecture. We heard this repeatedly in our 2 days of meetings. If, as the U.S. has said, China is the pacing challenge for America, the U.S. must compete across all domains, including the all-important trade and economic sphere in Asia. As I said just a moment ago, the region, the ASEAN economies in particular, are absolutely trade dependent. If the region is to be able to maintain an independent and open posture, which is a principal stated goal of U.S. policy, a robust trade agenda is essential. This was hammered home to us repeatedly. Unfortunately, to the extent the most recent U.S. initiative, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, was referenced at all in our Singapore meetings, the views expressed, I'm sorry to say, were largely dismissive. Our principal recommendation, there are a number, but our principal recommendation, given the unfortunate absence of the U.S. from the CPTPP, an agreement for which we were initially responsible, but as you'll recall, walked away from, is that the U.S. seriously consider embarking on a reciprocal trade agreement with the ASEAN countries, something that is more balanced, perhaps, than some would argue the TPP was, but nonetheless, that puts us in the regional game, as our interlocutors repeatedly stress. This recommendation reflects regional and global reality, and the sense of urgency imparted to us by our ASEAN colleagues. So I'll stop there, David, and I think I now turn this over to Karl.
Let me very briefly then complement what my colleagues said and focus a bit more on the security and the military dimension. So 4 quick points. Number one is that the security, the military dimension of Southeast Asia, I think is underappreciated, especially in the maritime domain. So we're talking about an expanse as large as the United States. We look at the Strait of Malacca. Charlene had talked about some of the economic indicators in the region. Strait of Malacca, you have 40% of the world's merchandise goods being traded, passing through there each year. You have 25% of the world's oil and LNG through Strait of Malacca. You go into the South China Sea, you have 20% of global trade passing through the South China Sea every day. That has implications then for especially for our allies, key allies in East Asia, Philippines, Korea, Japan, and it certainly has implications for Taiwan scenarios. So that's point number one. Point number two is going back to David's excellent introduction. When we look at U.S. relations in Southeast Asia, you talk about diplomatic, informational, economic, which Charlene has done, and then military. And what we found in our dialogues in Singapore is that the military relationship, the defense relationship, seems to be in pretty good shape. David had mentioned some of the polling that is reflected in the report. One of the polls was Lowy's poll, which is the Asia Power Index, and it goes across these domains I just mentioned and looked at relative influence. It was striking that whereas the United States often behind economically, diplomatically, when you get to defense networks, that the United States power indicator or influence indicators at 72 and China at 28. Well, what do we mean by defense networks? Just broadly, defense military ties in the region, measured by the amount of exercises that go on between two nations or several combined nations, military training, hardware sales, meetings and dialogues. So as we've said now several times, we can look at the United States military efforts and presence in Southeast Asia and term by several of our Southeast Asia interlocutors as a real asset. And interestingly, continuity within this, because every 4 years in the United States, we have an election and we have churn in terms of our diplomats that are serving in the region, but the military more steady state. So here, I think that the Office of Secretary of Defense and the Indo-Pacific Command, not just now, but in preceding years, deserve a great amount of credit. One example of this is the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, a great institution in Honolulu, Hawaii, that convenes throughout the year many different conferences, training programs, courses that bring people from throughout the Asia Pacific region beyond to talk about non-traditional security issues, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, counterterrorism, maritime domain. To date now, over 28,000 alumni for APC at ISS exists throughout the region. Third point, security trends. Having said that the United States military and our Defense Department are well respected and postured in the region, going along with other trends that colleagues have spoken of that worrisome. One, China's economic gains in the region will eventually lead to more military influence. Economic gains lead, military follows. The second is that China's military posture is growing. It now has 328 surface combatants, more than the United States Navy has, and it concentrates those in Southeast Asia area, and it's appearing in the Indian Ocean. And China's investing a lot more in its military-to-military relations. Finally, if I could come back as well to what Danny had pointed about, political uncertainty. So as countries in Southeast Asia and around the world, they look at U.S. military capability, but for deterrence, it's capability plus the intention to use that capability. And with our own political uncertainty, then the effectiveness of long-term deterrence comes into question. Fourth and finally, some brief points then about U.S. defense and military strategy going forward. First of all, what we've heard in terms of strategic communications, as David had laid out very well at the beginning, the United States and its defense and military, they're operating always in a kind of Goldilocks zone with regard to strategic communications. You want to make sure that presence is understood and the value of it, but you can't overplay your hand. Secondly, and this is what Charlene had talked about, is this administration has developed the concept of integrated deterrence, where it has a military component, but goes much more beyond U.S. military component. It's about allies and partners. It's about your economy. And I give the administration good marks for trying to develop this concept of integrated deterrence. But the military, strong as it is right now in Southeast Asia, is inadequate to provide this integrated deterrence and a long-term standing presence of the United States in the region. Third point would be the emphasis that the military is placing and the Defense Department is placing on multilateral and multinational fora, using the middle powers or working with middle powers like Australia, Japan, India, and having them engaged inside of Southeast Asia and with ASEAN, creating these dense networks, giving ASEAN more agency. And as Secretary Blinken had said, rather than forcing ASEAN to choose between China and the United States, giving them agency and options to make their own choices. Fourth, the time distance factors that the United States military confronts with regard to Southeast Asia and to East Asia, that is the distance and the time it takes to move forces and materiel into the Western Pacific, is something that informs our military relations with Southeast Asia. So there's the question of needing operational access for contingencies, and perhaps more important, the logistics question of having areas that you can move stockpiles and logistics supplies forward to within the region that can be called upon in times of crises. And that's something that has a huge diplomatic dimension to it. And I know that the administration continues to work on it. And fifth and finally, with regard to U.S. military capabilities, right now, in many cases, advantage to the United States in competition with China. Having said that, we have an aging capital fleet, naval fleet. We have aging aircraft. We have aging equipment. And we need the investments Danny talked about from Congress in order to replace aging hardware, move to new generation hardware, for the Army and for the Marines to develop new kinds of capabilities that are relevant to Southeast Asia and to East Asia. And finally, to address the growing concern that I think is out there in terms of the wear and tear on our armed forces right now, having recruiting problems and problems within the ranks that need to be attended to. Again, I'll emphasize what Danny had, is that this is not only an executive problem. This is a problem that Congress must address.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you, Karl. You all done a very good job in keeping within your allotted time. And so let's turn to questions now. We have one question that wonders, as you all know, there are many conflicting island claims, particularly with Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and also Taiwan. And yet some of these claims seem to have gone somewhat dormant. The countries don't seem to be quite as exercised over them, or at least demonstrating their claims as much as they did in the past. What do you all think is going on here? Has China successfully exercised a kind of a threat that's made them think it's best to just lay low? Who would like to try that? Karl, maybe you should start with that, and then Danny.
Orville, I'd turn to Danny first, and perhaps supplement that with the military dimension.
Danny.
Well, it's a great question, but look, issues of national sovereignty, issues of territorial integrity, these are so central to what citizens demand from their governments, regardless of the system of government. I think that for sure, the claimant countries are not going to abandon their claims. They may dial down the messaging for a variety of reasons. I think among the reasons is that the relative forcefulness of the government's protests or efforts, or its relative circumspection, depends a lot on the party in power in a given country. So we've seen pretty dramatic shifts from administration to administration in democracies like Malaysia or like the Philippines. A lot more consistency from Vietnam, for example. I think China also brings immense resources to bear in the struggle over territorial claims in the South China Sea. That means significant carrots and their leverage, but also significant sticks that are very intimidating. So the Southeast Asia approach to China is sometimes described as a bamboo strategy: bend, but don't break. So there's a lot more passive resistance than there is active resistance. It's less vocal, but it's resistance nevertheless. I mean, the negotiations between ASEAN and China over a code of conduct in the South China Sea, something that Beijing has been pushing very hard in recent years, has gone nowhere. That's passive resistance. And I think for the U.S., we're not going to negotiate a settlement of competing territorial claims, but keeping a spotlight on the principles, on the relevant international law, so on freedom of the seas, on the binding judgment of the Law of the Sea Tribunal, that is both the right strategy, and it's also a reflection of U.S. interests and U.S. commitments.
Good. Thanks, Danny. We have another question. There was a recent Pew survey which did show a decline in sort of favorable responses to China. And the questioner wants us to ruminate for him on the question of, has China overplayed its hand? Maybe, David, you'd be a good person to start with here.
Well, the Pew survey that you just referred to, Orville, the most recent one, I assume is what the questioner was referring to, just came out within the last week. And it's a survey of China's reputation worldwide. And it shows a secular decline, a continued secular decline. This is not new, ladies and gentlemen. This now dates back 5, 6, 7 years. In China's reputation and influence, mind you, these are very imprecise, rather fuzzy concepts? Do you have a familiarity or a favorable feeling about China or not? So, one has to question in a way the Pew findings, whereas the two polls that we cite in our report, the Lowy poll and the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies polls, they are much more granular, much more specific in the questions they ask of their respondents, and therefore really offer much more. But the Pew poll sustains findings that we've seen over the region and over time. Interestingly, though, the Pew poll, if I'm not mistaken, only one Southeast Asian country was included in it this past poll, Indonesia. So, I don't think we can take too much away from the Pew poll, but your question, Orville, as to whether China is overplaying its hand, this is something that we have heard, I myself have heard when I was researching my book on U.S. and China and Southeast Asia. China is in some ways its own worst enemy. It's heavy-handed, it's coercive, it's kind of autistic. It doesn't listen at all. And it kind of mirror images. And it's in some ways its own worst enemy. Nonetheless, the sheer economic heft and the geographic proximity, mind you, if China were across the ocean as the Americans are, it would be a different story. But China, if you talk to Southeast Asians, they always point up there. It's right above us. It's like this big thundercloud that is hovering above us. So that's both an advantage for China, close proximity, but it's also a disadvantage. And the Belt and Road, I would just note, which is a really, impressive initiative, global initiative. Southeast Asia is absolutely central to it. However, since 2017, that's now 6 years ago, we've seen BRI encounter a number of difficulties that we elaborate somewhat in the report, and I won't take time to here. So, China's reputation in the region is also slipping. And it's also vulnerable, just like the Americans. So this is not a static situation. It's very dynamic.
And then not to be forgotten is the fact that many of these countries do have substantial ethnically Chinese populations, which are very ready-made receptor sites for various Chinese propaganda efforts.
Absolutely. And we do mention this in the report. The Chinese have increasingly purchased and dominated regional Southeast Asian media that are targeted certainly at the diaspora, the 18 million ethnic Chinese in the region, but more broadly, United Front activities, disinformation activities, espionage activities. So the Chinese are, really potentially triggering pushback. They're trying to pull the region towards them, but in fact, some of these actions may push the region away from them.
Danny, do you have any?
I would throw in one more point, which is that the competition in the region for water, the competition for fish, the competition for underseas resources is intensifying and becoming much more threatening to countries in Southeast Asia as these critical resources are being depleted, as the Mekong is being diverted, dammed. And these are trends that have a very direct impact on the livelihood of citizens in the country, and I think are increasingly reflected not only in polling, but in government attitudes and policies there.
Yeah, I'm not. Another thing to be remembered, Danny, apropos of water, is that every single major river system in Asia rises on the Tibetan Plateau, which is Chinese real estate. And they're building lots of dams, hydroelectric stations, and various other kinds of, things to protect their interest. But it's going to have downstream consequences. Okay, I think we have time for one final question. And Charlene, it looks like it has your name on it. This person wonders, did the U.S. influence decline after the TPP debacle?
I haven't seen polling data specifically at that, sort of juncture, but it stands to reason that it would have. And certainly one of the findings of the ISIS poll, which David referred to, is the loss of economic influence. And most assuredly, that is reflective of, among other things, U.S. withdrawal from TPP. This is a really serious issue. It is true, I think, that China has likely overreached. It's true that its coercive capabilities are greeted with substantial hostility on the part of Southeast Asians. But it is also the case, as a practical matter, that China's growing economic dominance exerts extraordinary impacts on these countries, making them reluctant to speak out oftentimes, making them reluctant to push back in a way that might engender Chinese retaliation or Chinese coercion. So this issue of China's economic dominance over the ASEAN countries and the fact that that is growing and that the U.S. really has not mustered a response to it to try and mitigate some of the deleterious impacts of that dominance is of increasing concern. Orville mentioned the pincer movement around the ASEAN countries. They certainly don't want to choose or have to choose or be forced to choose. But increasingly, we heard that they view their room for maneuver as shrinking. It's one of the reasons, interestingly, why they welcome a multipolar region. The more the number of actors, the more room ASEAN has as against the US and China. But that room is counteracted significantly by China's economic dominance and the failure to appropriately respond in some fashion to that, to provide at least meaningful alternative channels of commerce for the region. So, yes, certainly U.S. economic influence has declined. Certainly withdrawal from TPP is a factor that's embedded in that declining influence. And most assuredly, it's quite important for the U.S. to try and regain the initiative here, at a minimum, not fall further behind, but ideally to help counter or mitigate the impacts of China's growing hold on the region's economies.
Thank you, Charlene. If I may make one sort of closing observation, because we've come to the end of our time, I think, we have to remember when we look at Southeast Asia and the ASEAN countries, this is not a country. This is a group of countries, each with different interests, language, cultures, and histories of sometimes highly contentious histories. So it makes it a very difficult entity to relate to, except one-on-one. And that's not where the U.S. Actually sometimes is the strongest. But the final thing I would say is this. Having spent 2 days with this wonderful group of people, I think all of us in this meeting would agree that there is an immense reservoir of sort of natural goodwill and ease of interaction, openness. I mean, when we get together with the Chinese, it's a completely other feeling in the room. It's contentious, it's argumentative, it's people are being very polite and concerned, not with Southeast Asia. And so this is an unexploited resource that I think the U.S. could do much better in every aspect to engage. But alas, we have our own political problems, we have our own funding problems, and the world is wide, and there are many countries, and we, I think, have not paid the attention that we probably ought to have paid to ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia. Karl, Danny, Charlene, David, particular thanks to you, David, for really muscling this thing together and getting it out. We hope it has some good impact, and thanks to all of our audience for joining us today.